All right, here's the objectives of Part 1. We're going to talk about Congress as a representative body, and here we're going to talk about who represents us, these different theories of representation, and then we'll talk a little bit about representation in practice in terms of how we apportion, reapportion, and even gerrymandering when it comes to setting up congressional districts, and we'll talk about congressional burnout, and what are some of the motives of your congressperson. And so this is quite a lengthy section, so we're going to break this lecture into Part 1A and Part 1B. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about who represents. Who are the representatives? Remember, Congress is both a law-making institution for the nation and a representative assembly for the state and the districts. And so congressional elections are sometimes termed local events with national consequences. And so our founders envisioned a strong legislative and a relatively weak executive. They did not want power in the hands of a single body, and they mostly feared an oppressive leader or an impassioned majority. So if we think about who represents us, this is an example of how the founding fathers wanted to make sure that not all power was vested in one particular single body, and how they wanted to have a strong legislative branch. And so remember, we have a bicameral congressional situation where we have the House and the Senate. So here on this table is going to give you the requirements for the office. And to think about Congress as a representative body, remember, a congressperson's primary responsibility is to the district and to his or her constituents. That is, those people who reside in the area from which he's elected. So the House here, the minimum age is 25 years. You have to be a citizen for at least 7 of those years. And there are 435 House members elected from districts apportioned according to population. In the Senate, on the other hand, you have to be a little bit older, 30 years of age. You have to be a citizen for 9 years. So to be in Congress, you don't have to be a natural-born citizen. You can be a naturalized citizen. There are 100 senators who are elected by the state, with 2 per state. I want you to take particular note of where I have important on the constituency. House members, their constituents tend to take care of local issues. So if you're a House member, your constituencies is much more local. You have a smaller district. The senators represent the whole state. So they have both local and national interest when it comes to the constituency. So keep that in mind. All right. When we think about how this Congress is structured in the House, it's fragmented. It is based on the democratic principle, that is, the House of Representatives answers to the people. This is why they have elections every 2 years. So the House members have always been elected by people, by districts. So you and I, living in the state of Texas, live in a particular congressional district. Many of us who, if you're living in the Huntsville area, in the Woodlands area, your representative is Congressman Brady. Okay, so we live in that particular district. So those we elect to the U.S. House of Representatives are different than the people we elect to the Texas House of Representatives. So Kevin Brady represents this district's interest in Washington, D.C., but he's not the guy who goes to Austin in the Texas House of Representatives. I mention this because there seems to be a common thought process that this is the same person. Okay, so they're, in terms of the U.S. House of Representatives, they are elected every 2 years. So for example, here is the old congressional districts. And you can see that they are very much broken up, and this box here, that's the greater Houston area, has several different districts in it, while this region here is one huge district. And it's not by geography as much by population. So there's not a lot of people who live in District 23, whereas there's a lot of people who live in the districts of Harris County and the greater Houston area. Same with the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so they try to even out population so that the person who's representing District 23 represents the same number of people as the person who represents District 2, for example. All right, so in the House, that's the democratic principle, the idea that we're answering directly to the people who elect us. All right, the Senate was originally created on more of the representation or the federal principle. And here the idea is that representation is organized according to states in terms of the fact that all states should have equal representation. And this is, remember, from the New Jersey plan. So since the Senate was representing state governments rather than the people, representation would be equal and each state gets 2 senators. So originally, if you wanted to be a senator, you were elected by the state legislature from what state you were from. So originally, to be a state senator from the state of Texas, those individuals that we elected to go to the state legislature would then choose people to elect to be representatives of the state in the Senate. I know it sounds a little bit complicated. All right. That's until the 17th Amendment. When the 17th Amendment was passed, then we have people elected to the Senate seats in statewide elections. So the House members are elected by districts. I can only vote for people in my district, but I can vote statewide for the elections of the senators. So the Senate is designed to put a brake on the public's momentary passions. So the House is representing districts and they're elected every 2 years, so they have to be much more in tune to what the people in the districts want. They're always up for re-election. Senators have the luxury of being in office for 6 years, so they tend to have a much more general or broad view of issues rather than trying to cater to one particular small district in the state. They have to appease everybody in the state. So the smaller Senate encourages much more deliberation, much more debate. It discourages specialization on particular issues because senators serve a larger, diverse statewide constituency, whereas House members serve a district constituency. All right, so let's think about Congress as a whole. The founders envisioned the House of Representatives as being more responsive to the people, paying more attention to district needs, whereas the Senate would be a more deliberative body. So the Senate is always designed to look towards the interests of the nation as a whole, whereas the House tends to represent district interests. And I'm repeating that because I want you to make sure you get that down. It's very important to understand what the goal and the rationale of the House is versus the Senate. So again, in terms of differences in representation, we have this bicameral system, 2 chambers. It's part of that Connecticut Compromise where each state has 2 senators. We've changed how we elect those folks, but each state gets 2, so we have 100 senators. And representation in the House is determined by state population. And so we have 2 different models of representation when it comes to the House and the Senate. The Senate is representing the whole state. They have longer terms. House members are representing districts, and they have shorter terms. But there's another way to think about representation. And that is a difference between what we call agency representation and sociological representation. And if you look at this photo, you can tell it's a little dated. It's probably from the 50s and 60s. But how would you characterize all these particular individuals? Mostly white males, probably over the age of 50. There's one female right there. So this is the idea of the difference between agency representation and sociological representation. And here is where I'm going to define the difference. But keep in mind this picture of what these individuals look like. The concept of agency representation is the idea that you hire and fire your representatives. Think of professional athletes. They hire an agent, and the job of that agent is to represent the interests of the athlete. Well, our Congress people are the same way. We hire them through the voting process to represent our interests, and we can fire them at the next election. So this sort of representation takes place when constituents have the power to hire and fire their representatives or their agents. So we hold them accountable, and if they fail to represent the constituency or they fail to do the things we want them to do, then we can vote them out of office. So there's an incentive for good representation even when the person's backgrounds, views, and interests differ from those of his or her constituency. So if we go back to this picture, this is an idea of agency representation. These folks don't have the similar background, views, and interests of me, a female working in the university system. These are white males over the age of 50. Of course, this is a different time period. But in this situation, we would think of these as agency representation because they don't look like you and I. When you have a representation based on more sociological factors, that's when you have the idea that people, in terms of sociological representation, those people who represent you have some shared, what we call salient characteristic: race, gender, ethnicity, religion. It's based on the idea that if two individuals are similar in background, character, and interests and perspectives, then they could represent my views in a better fashion. So said another way, individuals feel represented when there are others in Congress who have similar backgrounds or characteristics. And the assumption here is that sociological similarity promotes good representation. So the composition of a properly constituted legislature ought to mirror the society it represents. So the question becomes, does Congress represent the society it represents? So if we think about the male-female population in this country, females outnumber males. Usually it's about 48 to 52, but this figure shows 49.3 to 50.7. In the House of Representatives, there are 73 females, and this was as the last session. So that's only 17% of the House members are females, and only 15% of the senators are females. So this is not a sociological representation when it comes to gender. When it comes to race, African Americans make up about 12.4%, Hispanics about 15%, Asian Pacific about 4.5%. When we look at the racial composition of the House and Senate, we can see that in the House it's getting close. 44 members of the House are African American at 10%, but there are no African American senators at this point. Remember, Barack Obama was a senator but became president. In terms of Hispanics, they are woefully underrepresented in Congress. Only 5% of the House members, only 2 senators are Hispanic, compared to the 15% in the population. In terms of Asian, there's also underrepresentation. There are 9 Asian Americans representing in the House and 2 senators. But again, that's less than 2% compared to 4.5% in the overall population. Age. The average House age is 56. The average age of a senator is 62. This is not the mean age of America. All right. But this is changing. Over time, you can see how women have made some gains in terms of representation, as have African Americans and Latinos, but not nearly as high as they should be to have a true sociological representation. There are some wonderful graphs in your book to show this to you in a different way. And so if we look at the whole population in terms of gender, here you can see half are female and half are male, but graphically you can tell that in the House, again, only 15% in the House and only 17% in the whole in the Senate. So again, if red is females, they're being much more or less represented in Congress as they are in the general population. So this would not be an example of sociological representation. We have to rely on the idea of agency representation, where those people who are representing us can represent us, and we can fire them if they're not carrying out the policies that we want. Here is where race is in the population. Whites make up 65%, but you can see how much they dominate in the House and even more in the Senate. Here in the House, when it comes to African Americans, you can see how they are underrepresented in the House, but particularly in the Senate. The same for Hispanics. And so you can see, again, that there is not sociological representation when it comes to race. When it comes to religion, it's a little closer. Protestants make up half of the population. They're just a little bit overly represented in the House and Senate. Catholics are represented well, other Christian and Jews. So when it comes to religion, we seem to have a pretty fair representation of members of Congress in terms of a sociological representation. When it comes to education, again, there is a disproportion when we think about the level of education. In terms of high school, 57% of the public has at least a high school graduation, and only 8% of the House and the Senate. They are much more educated than what the percentages are in the general public. So in terms of a bachelor's degree, 19% of the citizenry has a bachelor's degree, and of course the House and Senators have a higher ranking of that. Professional law degree, you can see this is exactly where the House and the Senate members have a lot more education than the general public. The number one profession of both the House and the Senate are lawyers. The average age in the U.S. population is 37, and you can see how the House and the Senate are much more older than the average age. So I think it's safe to say that we are not relying on sociological representation in the United States, but we have to rely on agency representation. All right, let's say a few things about Congress as a representative body when it comes to the electoral process and the electoral connection between the constituent and the individual running for Congress. All right, so two factors that relate to the electoral system is who gets elected and what do they do in office. And so the first is the incumbency advantage. And the second one is the way congressional district lines are drawn. But we're going to talk about the way district lines are drawn in the next, in part 1B. So let's just focus on the incumbency. What are the advantages of being an incumbent? All right. An incumbent is someone who already has a political office and they're running for re-election. That is the ability to retain one's office election after their initial election. So, in terms of statistics, incumbents win for House members approximately 98% of the time and senators 96% of the time. So, historically, being an incumbent is an advantage. Okay? The most recent election, however, incumbents were battered. We know that we have entered into an anti-incumbency mood in America, where many people voted in the last election on whoever wasn't the incumbent. Okay? But incumbents have an advantage because they can provide constituents with services to ensure re-election. Okay. These services include taking care of individual requests. So, for example, if you retired and didn't get your retirement or your Medicare payment, you can call your local congressman. So these services include individual requests, regular communications with constituents. So most House members feel like they have a much closer relationship with their constituents than someone who is running for the first time. Incumbents can help a candidate by scaring off potential challengers. A lot of times incumbents have a war chest, have money already built up that would prevent a newcomer from entering the office. Incumbents also have some privileges that come with office. So mailing, for example, you have what's called the franking privilege as an incumbent, where you get to send mail from your congressional office that the taxpayer pays for. So you'll probably start getting some mail in your mailbox from the incumbent of whoever your senators are and whoever is your House member. So there are some definite advantages. The other is name recognition. So people already know who you are, they know what you've done for them in the past, and it's easier for you to make an argument that you'll continue doing things for them in the future than it is for someone new trying to make an argument that they would make a better congressperson than your incumbent. So there's lots of advantages to being in Congress. The advantage of incumbency also preserves the status quo in Congress in terms of the social composition, in terms of who are Republicans and who are Democrats. But you're going to hear a lot in this upcoming election about what are safe seats and what are not safe seats. So a safe seat is, for example, if a Democrat is in that particular district, he's considered to have, or she is considered to have a safe district or a safe seat if there is no chance that a challenger can unseat them. And you have a safe seat if you're running unopposed or if the constituencies are overwhelmingly from one political party or another. But if you're in a district that's highly competitive, this is where both parties are going to take advantage of that knowledge and try to advertise in that particular district in order to gain seats. All right, or through the media. Again, here are a list of those incumbency advantages. The constituency services that I talked about, franking privileges, that's the mail, the name recognition, you're running on the title of incumbent and current congressperson. There's also things that are associated with how you bring home the bacon, and that's called pork barrel spending. And so one of the things that Congress members do, particularly in the House, is make the argument that they are bringing home those dollars back to the district. So on the previous lecture, I showed you how much federal money is coming back to each state. And so if you can claim as a congressperson that you are bringing federal dollars into the district, that means you're bringing home pork. That means you're bringing home the bacon. And basically that says that you can get legislation passed to fund different issues in your district, such as a new highway, a new dam, any type of spending by the federal government that would create jobs in your district. That's referred to as pork barrel legislation. And if you've been successful at that, then you're going to make a good incumbent and a good candidate.